I never told my son about my $90,000 a month salary. His wife said, "Get out, you beggar." My son threw my things out the door. A month later, I bought the house of their dreams right across the street when they saw my name. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Elaine Caldwell. I was 61 years old when my daughter-in-law called me a pauper, and my son threw my suitcase onto the front porch. And the strangest part? Not once in all the years before that night had I ever told either of them what I earned. Let me take you back to the beginning. I had worked as a senior financial compliance officer for a private investment firm in Atlanta for nearly 2 decades. The work was quiet, careful, and well compensated. My salary, $90,000 a month, was something I had never announced to anyone. Not out of shame, out of habit. My mother had raised me to believe that money spoken of carelessly becomes a weapon in someone else's hands. I kept my finances the way I kept my personal life, orderly, private, and mine. When my husband Gerald passed 8 years ago from a stroke, I threw myself into work. Our son, Daniel, was 32 by then, grown, settled, employed as a project manager at a mid-size construction firm. I was proud of him. He had Gerald's jawline and my stubbornness, which I always considered a blessing in the right proportions. Daniel met Kristen at a mutual friend's barbecue in the summer of 2019. She was pretty in an obvious way, loud in a charming way, and absolutely certain of her own intelligence in a way I recognized as fragile, but chose to overlook. I liked her. I tried to like her. I brought her flowers when she moved in with Daniel. I helped address their wedding invitations. I held my tongue when she rearranged the furniture during Christmas dinner before the guests had even arrived. For 3 years, I visited every few weeks. I stayed no more than a weekend. I brought groceries, helped with the garden, babysat their rescue dog Biscuit when they traveled. I never once asked Daniel about his finances. I never once asked Kristen to justify herself to me. I thought we had a quiet understanding. The kind that doesn't need to be named. I was wrong about that. The first warning sign came in January of last year. I arrived for a visit and noticed my usual room, the small guest bedroom at the end of the hall, had been converted into a meditation studio. There was a purple yoga mat on the floor and a diffuser making the air smell like eucalyptus. Kristen mentioned it casually while refilling her coffee, that she hoped I didn't mind sleeping on the pull-out sofa in the living room. She did not ask. She hoped. I slept on the sofa. The second sign came a month later. I overheard Kristen on the phone with her sister. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was walking past the kitchen doorway, but I heard her clearly enough. She doesn't contribute anything, Sandra. She just shows up and expects to be treated like royalty, and Daniel won't say a word about it. I stood still for a moment. Then I continued walking to the living room and sat down with my book. The third sign came in April. Kristen began asking Daniel, within earshot of me, about the possibility of them needing more space. She had a habit of framing all her desires as mutual. We feel like we need more privacy, Daniel. We feel like it's important to establish our household boundaries. I watched Daniel nod along, and I recognized something in his nod that I didn't want to name yet. But it was the evening of May 14th that changed everything. I had taken the train down for what I believed was a planned visit. Daniel had texted me the week before, "Come this Saturday, Mom. We miss you." And I had made a pot of homemade chili to bring along and packed a small bag for 2 nights. I arrived at 6 in the evening. Kristen answered the door. She looked at me, at my bag, at the pot in my hands, at my sensible shoes, and her expression shifted from surprised to something else entirely, something I can only describe as decision. "Margaret," she said, and she had never called me that before. It had always been either nothing or an obligatory Mom. Daniel and I have been talking. We've decided we need this space for ourselves. We're not in a position to host family indefinitely. I looked past her shoulder. Daniel was standing in the hallway. He was looking at his phone. "Daniel," I said. He looked up. He looked at me, and then he looked back down. Kristen stepped onto the porch and kept her voice even and pleasant, the way someone does when they've rehearsed the conversation 3 times. "We think it would be better for everyone if you found your own place to stay when you visit. You're retired, right? You must have some savings. There are perfectly nice hotels not far from here." I thought about correcting the word retired. I was not retired. I had never said I was retired. But I looked at Daniel, who was still examining his phone screen, and I understood that the word retired was not an accident. It was an architecture. They had built a version of me, diminished, dependent, done, and they had been living next to it for some time now. "Get out," Kristen said then, and dropped the pleasantness entirely. "I mean it, Margaret. You've got nowhere to be and nothing to offer. We don't need a penniless old woman camped out in our home." Daniel set his phone on the hallway table and walked upstairs without saying a word. 10 minutes later, my 2-night bag landed on the porch beside me with a soft thud. He had come down, picked it up from the hallway where I'd set it, and put it outside. He never opened the door again. I stood on that porch for a moment, just a moment, in the warm May evening, with the pot of chili still in my hands and the sound of their television starting up inside. Then I walked to my car, set the chili on the passenger seat, and drove to a hotel downtown. And somewhere between the hotel lobby and the elevator up to my room, I made a decision. The hotel was a Marriott on Peachtree Street. Clean, impersonal, the kind of place where the corridors all look the same and no one asks you anything. I appreciated that enormously on the night of May 14th. I sat on the edge of the bed, with my shoes still on and my coat folded over my arm. The chili was in the hotel mini fridge. I had eaten half of it for dinner with a plastic spoon I found near the coffee station, sitting at the small desk by the window, watching the headlights move along the street below. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because in the stories people tell about moments like this one, there is usually crying. But I had spent 35 years in financial compliance. I had learned, a long time ago, to feel things sequentially, to let the emotion register cleanly, and then to set it aside and look at what the facts actually were. So I looked at the facts. Fact, my son had stood in a hallway holding his phone, while his wife told me I had nothing to offer, and he had said nothing. Fact, they believed I was, as Kristen had put it, penniless, or close enough to it. Fact, I had never corrected that impression because I had never created it. I had simply never contradicted the story they had quietly built about me. Fact, I earned $90,000 a month, had done so for nearly 2 decades, had invested carefully and lived modestly, and possessed assets that would make Kristen's jaw unhinge from her face if she ever knew the number. Was there some part of me that felt the cruelty of being dismissed by my own child? Yes. I won't pretend otherwise. Daniel was my son, the boy I had sat up with through fevers and nightmares and the particular agony of high school, the boy who used to call me every Sunday without fail until he married Kristen. I felt that loss clearly and precisely, the way you feel a bone that isn't broken but might be. But I also felt something else beneath the grief, something quieter and more durable. Fury is too dramatic a word. It was more like clarity. They had made an assumption. The assumption was the error, and the error had consequences. I opened my laptop and spent 2 hours that night looking at real estate, not rental listings, not temporary furnished apartments, real estate listings, properties for sale within a 2-mile radius of Daniel and Kristen's house in the Brookhaven neighborhood of Atlanta. Why so close? I will be honest about that, too. Part of it was practical. I had spent 3 years weaving Daniel's neighborhood into my rhythms. The coffee shop I liked, the walking trail along the creek, the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. I was not going to be exiled from a neighborhood by a yoga mat and a woman who called me a penniless old woman on my own son's porch. But part of it, the part I'm less comfortable admitting, was something colder. I had been made invisible by their assumption. I thought perhaps it was time to become very, very visible. I found it on the 3rd page of listings. A colonial-style home at 412 Whitmore Lane. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, an original hardwood floor running throughout, a wraparound porch, and a garden that had gone slightly to seed but had good bones. It was directly across the street from Daniel and Kristen's house. I stared at the listing photo for a long time. The house was not the point. The house, its history, its structure, its garden, would come to matter to me genuinely in time. But that first night, sitting on the edge of a Marriott bed with a plastic spoon and leftover chili, I looked at that photograph and felt something settle into place inside me. The asking price was $1.2 million. I had the money. I called my real estate attorney, Beverly Marsh, the next morning. Beverly was 64, had represented me in 2 previous property transactions, and was constitutionally incapable of being surprised by anything. I told her what I wanted to do and why. There was a pause on the line. "Margaret," she said, "that is either the most brilliant thing I've heard this year or the most dramatic. Can it be both?" I asked. "In my experience," she said, "when the same woman does both, she's usually right." She began the preliminary inquiry that afternoon. Meanwhile, I called my doctor, checked in with my office. I was working a reduced remote schedule, not retired, never retired, and made myself an appointment at the hair salon for the following Thursday. I had learned long ago that when life delivers a blow, the worst thing you can do is stop tending to yourself. The world reads your appearance as information. I intended to control what it read. I also did not call Daniel. I want to be clear about the architecture of that decision. I did not stay silent because I was too hurt to speak. I stayed silent because I understood with absolute precision that any conversation I initiated at that point would give them the opportunity to frame me as emotional, as reactive, as the difficult mother-in-law causing scenes. They had already written the story. I was not going to walk into it. I would wait, I would move, and then the story would rewrite itself. Over the following 2 weeks, Beverly confirmed the property was available, the sellers were motivated, and the transaction could be completed in 30 days if I moved to a cash offer. I moved to a cash offer. The inspection came back clean, save for a few minor repairs to the roof guttering and a bathroom that needed re-grouting. I negotiated $15,000 off the asking price. The sellers agreed. I signed the purchase agreement on June 3rd. Closing was scheduled for June 28th. I told no one in Daniel's circle, not a family friend, not a distant cousin, not anyone who might let something slip at the wrong moment. I had worked in compliance for 35 years. I knew how to manage information. 13 days later, I would receive the piece of information that changed my plan from personal to necessary. The first official step was quieter than you might expect. Beverly filed the purchase documentation under a holding company, a limited liability corporation I had established years earlier for property management purposes, named Caldwell Heritage Properties, LLC. It was entirely legal, entirely standard, and meant that the name Margaret Elaine Caldwell appeared nowhere in the public documents during the pending sale. Anyone searching the county recorder's database would find a corporate entity purchasing the property at 412 Whitmore Lane. Nothing more. Was I hiding? No. I was simply not announcing. There is a difference, one I had always understood professionally, between concealment and discretion. Concealment implies wrongdoing. Discretion implies judgment. I was exercising judgment. I drove past 412 Whitmore Lane twice during those weeks. Once after the inspection, once after the price negotiation. Both times I parked down the street and sat for a moment, looking at the house's wide porch and the old magnolia tree in the front yard that had shed half its leaves onto the walk. Both times I could see Daniel and Kristen's house directly across the lane. The front door painted a fashionable dark gray, Kristen's white SUV in the driveway, the potted topiaries she'd placed on either side of the front steps. I thought about what it would feel like when they saw the moving truck. Then I drove away and thought about something more useful. It was during the second week of June, 12 days after Beverly began the purchase process, that I received a phone call from my nephew, Paul. Paul was Gerald's brother's son, 38 years old, and worked in property development. He was also, crucially, the kind of person who talked to everyone and remembered everything. "Aunt Margaret," he said, "I don't know if this is any of my business, but Daniel called me last week." I waited. "He was asking about your finances, specifically whether you'd ever had any significant assets or whether you'd always been," his word, not mine, "comfortable but not wealthy." I set down my coffee cup. "What did you tell him?" I asked. "I said I honestly didn't know," Paul said. "Which is true. You've never discussed it with me either. But Aunt Margaret, the reason I'm calling is because he also asked me whether I thought you'd need financial assistance in the next few years, as in whether the family should be thinking about that." I picked up my coffee cup again and took a sip. "He asked you whether I needed charity." That's essentially what he was asking, yes. I thanked Paul sincerely and ended the call. Then I sat for a long moment at my kitchen table in the apartment I was renting month to month, while the closing on Whitmore Lane processed, a 2-bedroom in Buckhead that I had taken furnished because I had not yet told my apartment building in Midtown that I was moving. And I considered what Daniel's inquiry meant. It meant he was building a case, not for cruelty's sake. Daniel wasn't cruel by nature, only weak, which is a different and in some ways more dangerous condition. He was building a case to justify, to himself and to Kristen, what had already been done. They had thrown me out in May. Now in June, he was quietly canvassing people to confirm that I was, in fact, financially diminished. He was retrospectively justifying the decision to abandon me. But here is what troubled me more than the justification itself. If Daniel was making calls, he was also potentially making plans. And some of those plans might involve my finances in ways I had not anticipated. I called Beverly. "I need to review my estate documents," I told her. "Today, if possible. And I need to understand what my current will says about Daniel's position." There was the familiar pause of a woman who had heard everything. "I'll have the documents ready by 2:00, she said. I drove to Beverly's office in Buckhead that afternoon. Her office was on the 12th floor of a building that overlooked Lenox Road, all clean glass and good leather chairs, and the particular hush of a space where serious things are decided without drama. We reviewed the will. Under its current terms, Daniel was the primary beneficiary of my estate, roughly 70% of my assets, with the remainder going to 2 charitable organizations I had supported for years. "I want to change this," I said. Beverly nodded as if she had been waiting for exactly this sentence. "I'd like to remove Daniel as primary beneficiary," I said. "I'd like to establish a charitable trust as the primary vehicle, with a discretionary provision that allows for future amendments, and I'd like this done before closing." "You're protecting against a potential future claim," Beverly said. "I'm protecting against a present one," I said. "Daniel doesn't know what I have, but he's starting to wonder. And wondering can become investigating, and investigating can become legal action, and I prefer to do my legal work before someone else decides to do theirs." Beverly had the amended will drafted within a week. I signed it on June 19th. It was the point of no return. Not because the will made anything irreversible, it could be amended again, but because signing it forced me to make conscious and permanent what had previously been merely emotional. The recognition that my son had placed himself on a different side of a line from me, and that I needed to respond accordingly, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. On June 28th, the closing on 412 Whitmore Lane was completed. I was the owner of a 4-bedroom colonial house directly across the street from Daniel and Kristen. They did not yet know it, but I noticed on that same afternoon as Beverly sent me the final confirmation documents that Kristen had posted a new set of photographs on her social media. The living room freshly redecorated in white and gold, the caption reading, "Our dream home, all to ourselves. Finally." I looked at the photographs for a long moment. Then I closed the tab and began scheduling my moving company. The moving company arrived at 412 Whitmore Lane on a Saturday morning in mid-July. It was a warm day, that particular Atlanta warmth that sits on your shoulders like a hand. And the magnolia tree in the front yard had recovered some of its composure since I'd had the walks swept and the garden lightly tidied. I had spent the previous week at the house in an unofficial capacity, directing the handful of tradespeople Beverly had helped me contract for the gutter repairs and the bathroom regrouting, choosing paint colors from samples I taped to the walls, walking through each room at different times of day to understand how the light moved. The house had good bones, as I'd thought from the listing. It had been owned by a retired professor for 30 years before his family sold it, and it had the quiet, settled quality of a place where someone had actually lived rather than simply staged for resale. I liked it immediately and genuinely. That surprised me a little. I had expected to feel strategic about it. Instead, I felt at home. The moving truck was large. I had pulled my furniture from a storage unit where I had placed it 2 years earlier, following a partial apartment consolidation, and it blocked much of Whitmore Lane for the better part of 3 hours. The crew was professional and efficient. I directed traffic from the porch with a clipboard and a cup of coffee. I did not look across the street. I didn't need to. I could feel the moment they noticed. It happened at about 10:30 in the morning. I heard the front door of Daniel and Kristen's house open. Then I heard Kristen's voice. Not the words, just the pitch and register of it, which told me everything. Then silence. Then Daniel's voice. Then a long pause. Then footsteps crossing the street. I was reviewing the placement of a bookcase with one of the movers when Kristen appeared at the end of my front walk. She was wearing athleisure wear, and her hair was pulled back, and she had the expression of someone who has just seen something that violates the internal logic of their universe. "What is this?" she said. I turned and looked at her pleasantly. "Good morning, Kristen. It's a moving truck. This is your house?" Her voice had gone very flat. "You bought this house?" "I did," I said. Would you like some coffee? I have a thermos. She stared at me. How? How did you? You thought I was a penniless old woman who had nowhere to be and nothing to offer, I said. And I said it without any particular heat, the way you repeat a fact back to someone to demonstrate that you've retained it. I remember. You said it on your porch. The color that moved across Kristen's face was extraordinarily complex. "Daniel," she called without turning. He had been standing at the edge of the front walk, I realized, for at least 30 seconds. He walked up slowly. He looked at the house. He looked at me. He looked at the movers carrying in my dining room table, which I had chosen 30 years ago at an estate sale, and refinished myself. "Mom," he said, "just that." "Daniel," I said. There was a long silence. A mockingbird in the magnolia tree sang 3 separate songs in quick succession, which seemed appropriate. "You can't be serious," Kristen said, turning back to me. Her voice had found its edge again. "You did this on purpose. You did this to spy on us, to harass us." "I bought a house," I said, "in a free market, in a neighborhood I've been visiting for 3 years. There's no legal mechanism preventing that." "We'll see about that," she said. And the way she said it told me she was reaching for weapons she didn't actually have. I didn't respond. I turned back to the mover and told him the bookcase looked fine where it was. Over the following 3 days, I received 4 phone calls from Daniel, which I did not answer. I received 2 text messages, one asking me to reconsider, which was vague enough to mean nothing, one telling me that what I was doing was not normal behavior, which I found slightly amusing given the circumstances. On the 3rd day, an attorney's letter arrived at my new address. Kristen had retained a family law attorney, a man named Brett Hollis, who had sent a letter suggesting that my purchase of the adjacent property constituted an act of targeted harassment and threatening to file for a restraining order if I engaged in any form of surveillance, trespassing, or intimidation. I forwarded it to Beverly. Beverly's response when she called me that afternoon was almost musical in its restraint. "He's citing a statute that applies to domestic abuse situations between former intimate partners," she said. "You are your son's mother. You purchased a property on the open market using lawful funds. You have had precisely 1 conversation with your daughter-in-law since moving in which she approached you in public on your own property. What do you recommend?" I asked. "I recommend we send Mr. Hollis a very polite letter explaining that we are aware of the applicable law, that my client has committed no actionable conduct, and that any attempt to file a frivolous restraining order will be met with a counterclaim for attorney's fees and sanctions." We sent it. Mr. Hollis did not respond. That evening, I sat on my wraparound porch in the early dusk and watched the fireflies come out over the garden. My neighbor to the north, a retired schoolteacher named Doris, I would later learn, waved from her own porch, and I waved back, and we didn't say anything, which was the right amount of communication for a first evening. I was tired. Not the tired of defeat, but the tired of sustained intensity, of the kind of concentrated, deliberate effort that costs something real. I allowed myself 3 days of quiet. I called no one professional. I made no decisions. I sat in the garden in the mornings, walked along the creek trail, ate well, slept long, and let the house begin to feel like mine. On the 4th morning, I made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. There was more to be done. I could feel it. It was Doris who told me, without knowing she was doing so, that I needed to stop moving in private and start living in public. We had our first real conversation 3 days after my quiet period ended. She was deadheading her roses along the fence line, and I had brought out a pair of gardening gloves to begin work on my own somewhat neglected beds. And we fell into the natural rhythm of 2 people who are both crouching near the ground and have nothing urgent to accomplish. Doris Whitfield was 68 years old, had lived at her address on Whitmore Lane for 22 years, and had watched the neighborhood change with the equanimity of someone who had long ago decided that equanimity was the only reasonable response to change. She had been a high school English teacher for 30 years. Her husband had died of cancer 6 years prior. She had 2 daughters who called her every Sunday, and she was, as I would come to understand, the informal social memory of the entire block. The house has been empty for nearly a year, she told me, working her pruning shears around a particularly leggy stem. Dr. Abernathy's family took forever to settle his estate. We're all glad someone's moved in. It's a good house, I said. It is, she agreed. I always said so. Dr. Abernathy used to have the most beautiful hydrangea along that south fence. You should think about replanting it. We talked for 40 minutes. She did not ask me anything personal, neither did I. But by the end of it, I had been invited to her garden club's monthly meeting, which apparently took place in members' houses in rotation, and had accepted. I liked her. She was precise and warm in equal measure, which is a rare and valuable combination. It was the following week that the first attempt at what I can only call temptation arrived. Daniel called on a Tuesday morning. I was at my desk. I worked from home on Tuesdays reviewing compliance filings for 2 ongoing client accounts, and I let it ring twice before I answered. Not to be difficult, but because I had learned to let things arrive at their own pace rather than rushing toward them. "Mom," he said, "I want to talk." His voice was different from the last time I had heard it. Quieter, more careful. Kristen's influence was present in the preparation of it. I could tell. This was not a spontaneous call. "I'm listening," I said. "We, Kristen and I, think that this situation has gotten out of hand. We'd like to sit down with you, have a real conversation, put things behind us." "That's a generous framing," I said. "Mom, please. We've been talking, and we agree that some things were said that shouldn't have been said, and we'd like to move forward." Did I feel the pull of it? Yes. I will not pretend I didn't. He was my son. The sound of his voice saying "please" in that particular register, the register I associated with the 18-year-old who used to call home from college when something had gone wrong, reached something in me that I had not fully armored against. But I was listening very carefully to what he was actually saying. He had not said, "I was wrong." He had not said, "I should have stopped Kristen." He had not said, "You deserved better from me." He had said that things had been said that shouldn't have been said. A passive construction designed to distribute responsibility so evenly that no one could be held to any of it, and that they wanted to move forward. Move forward almost always means let me off the hook and stop doing the thing that makes me uncomfortable. "I'm not interested in moving forward for its own sake, Daniel," I said. "If you want to have a genuine conversation about what happened, I'm available for that. But I won't agree in advance to outcomes before we've had it." There was a pause. "Kristen thinks," he started. "What do you think?" I asked. "Not Kristen, you." Another pause, longer this time. "I think we should talk," he said, "in person." "Then come over," I said, "whenever you're ready. You know where I live." He did not laugh. I had not expected him to. But I had said it anyway, and it settled something for me. A small, precise weight lifted from my chest. I did not hear from him again that week. But something else happened that week that mattered more. I went to Doris's garden club meeting, held at a woman named Patricia's house 4 blocks away, and I met 6 women ranging in age from 55 to 79, and I sat among them for 2 hours and drank good tea and listened and talked. And by the end of it, I felt something I had not felt since May. Anchored, that was the word. I had been floating since the evening on Daniel's porch, in a space that was strategic and necessary but profoundly solitary. The plan I was executing was the right plan, but a plan without community around it has no texture, no witness, no life. These women, Doris, Patricia, and the others, were not part of my plan. They were better than the plan. They were my actual life on Whitmore Lane beginning. I walked home that evening through the warm August air, past the hydrangea patch I had begun to rehabilitate, and I felt, clearly and calmly, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. They came on a Saturday. I had not been given advance notice. The doorbell rang at 11 in the morning while I was on the porch reading a biography of a woman I admired, a Federal Reserve economist who had been consistently underestimated throughout her career and had found that quietly instructive. And I looked up to see both of them standing at my front gate. Kristen was carrying a plant, a small potted orchid wrapped in tissue paper. The orchid said, "We come in peace." The set of Kristen's jaw said something else entirely. I set my book down and went to the door. "We were in the neighborhood," Kristen said, which was technically true in a way I found faintly absurd. She held out the orchid. "We wanted to bring this as a housewarming." I accepted the orchid. "Thank you, come in." I made coffee. I am a good host. This is not a function of warmth in every circumstance. It is a function of discipline. I put out the cups I liked, the ones I'd bought at an estate sale in Decatur, and I sliced the lemon pound cake I had made the previous day because I had felt like baking. And we sat at my kitchen table in the house they had presumably not imagined I owned. And I looked at them and waited. Kristen spoke first. "Margaret, we want you to know that we've reflected seriously on the way things have gone. And we think, both of us, that family is important. We don't want to be at odds." It was beautifully delivered. I noted the word reflected rather than reconsidered, which implies thinking but not revision. I noted the word odds rather than conflict, which depersonalizes what happened. "That's good to hear," I said. "We were thinking," Daniel said, and he looked at his coffee cup as he said it, "that maybe now that you've settled here, there might be a way to restructure things, make things feel more normal." "What would that look like?" I asked. And here is where the mask shifted. Kristen leaned forward slightly. "Well, for example, you're here, right across the street. We're here. It would make sense to think about how that affects things like..." She paused, and the pause was calculated. Property, estate planning, long-term family arrangements. I let the silence sit for a moment. "You're asking about my estate," I said. Kristen did not flinch. "We're saying that now that we're neighbors, it makes sense to think about the future together, as a family. We could be part of your decision-making," Daniel added, and I heard in the word part the shadow of the word control. "You shouldn't have to manage all of this alone." I looked at my son. I thought about the boy I had raised, not with rose-tinted nostalgia, but with the clarity of genuine memory. He had been, in childhood, a gentle and perceptive child. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had allowed someone else's desire to become his own, so gradually and completely that he had forgotten where one ended and the other began. "Daniel," I said, "I appreciate the concern, but I have an attorney, an accountant, and a financial advisor who are all fully capable of helping me manage my affairs. What I don't have any particular shortage of is input." Kristen's voice hardened with remarkable speed. "What we're saying, Margaret, and I think you know this, is that this situation you've created, buying this house, living here, it's not sustainable. It's not normal. People talk." "Which people?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Neighbors, family, everyone can see what you're doing." "And what am I doing?" I asked. She paused. Because the honest answer, you are living your life in proximity to ours and it makes us uncomfortable, was not an accusation she could make openly without it collapsing under its own weight. You're trying to make us feel guilty, she said instead. I'm drinking coffee at my own kitchen table, I said. If you feel guilty, Kristen, that's a conversation between you and whatever you did to earn the feeling. Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Kristen stood up. This was a mistake, she said. We tried to be civil. We tried to extend an olive branch, and you brought me an orchid and asked about my estate within 10 minutes of sitting down, I said evenly. I'm not sure that's what an olive branch looks like. They left. Kristen walked quickly. Daniel walked more slowly and looked back once, just once, at the house, and then at me. And then he turned and followed his wife. I stood in the doorway for a moment after they'd gone. Did I feel fear? Yes. A small, cold version of it, sitting just below the sternum. Not fear of them precisely. Fear of the thing they represented. The possibility that this would never resolve, that my son had gone somewhere I couldn't follow, that the distance between who he had been and who he had become was now a permanent geography. But fear, I had learned in 61 years, is information, not instruction. It tells you something is at stake. It does not tell you to retreat. I went back inside. I cleared the coffee cups. I ate a piece of the lemon pound cake. Then I sat down at my desk and wrote Beverly a 4-paragraph email outlining exactly what had been said at my kitchen table, in the order it had been said, with specific attention to the language around estate planning and family arrangements. Document it, Beverly had told me at the very beginning. Everything, with dates. I had been documenting it since May. The Whitmore Lane Neighborhood Association held its quarterly meeting on the second Thursday of September in the community room of the local library on Dresden Drive. It was a small and functionally minded organization. They managed road maintenance complaints, coordinated the holiday lighting schedule, and occasionally weighed in on zoning variance applications for the surrounding blocks. Doris was the secretary. Patricia chaired it. I had not planned to attend. Then Paul called me on the Monday before the meeting. I thought you should know, he said. Kristen reached out to me again. She's apparently contacted 2 or 3 people in the neighborhood. I'm not sure how she got the contacts. And she's been telling them that her word was unstable. She's saying you bought the house as an act of revenge, that there are mental health concerns. I was quiet for a moment. She's doing what? Building a case, Paul said. I think they're planning to raise it at the neighborhood association meeting. I think they want to formally ask you to sell the house. Was I surprised? Not entirely. I had known from the day they appeared at my kitchen table with an orchid and a question about my estate that they were still in motion, still calculating. What surprised me was the reach of it. The willingness to go to strangers, to plan a story about my mental health, to try to use community pressure as a lever to move me. Did they understand who they were trying to lever? I called Beverly and told her what Paul had said. She's made specific representations about your mental fitness to third parties, Beverly said. That could constitute defamation, depending on exactly what was said and to whom. I'd get Paul's account in writing. Paul sent me a written summary that afternoon, including the date, the platform of the communication, and the specific language Kristen had used. I forwarded it to Beverly. Beverly made a note. Then I put on a good suit, a deep charcoal wool I had bought in London 8 years ago and maintained carefully since, and I went to the neighborhood association meeting. I arrived slightly early. Doris was setting up chairs. She gave me a long, appraising look when I walked in. I heard some things this week, she said. So did I said. Good, she said, and handed me a chair to unfold. There were 17 people in the room when the meeting began. Daniel and Kristen arrived 4 minutes after Patricia called it to order. Kristen was composed and dressed carefully. She understood the theater of public settings. Daniel sat beside her and looked at the table. The meeting proceeded through its ordinary items: a pothole on Whitmore that the city had failed to repair, a request for a new crosswalk near the elementary school, a brief discussion of the holiday tree lighting event. Then Kristen raised her hand. Patricia recognized her. Kristen stood and introduced herself. The Holloways. They had lived on Whitmore for 3 years. They loved the community. They had a concern to bring to the group. The concern, as she framed it, a recently purchased property across the street had raised questions about the buyer's motivations. She had reason to believe, she chose her words carefully, that the purchase had been made not out of genuine desire to be a community member, but as a personal targeting of her family. She had spoken to several neighbors. There was, she said, a pattern of behavior that the community should be aware of. She paused. She was waiting for murmur or for heads to turn toward me. No one murmured. Patricia looked at me. "Mrs. Caldwell," she said, "would you like to respond?" I stood. I did not look at Kristen. I looked at the people in the room, at Doris, at Patricia, at the faces I recognized from 6 weeks of becoming a neighbor, a garden club member, a person on this street. "My name is Margaret Elaine Caldwell," I said. "I'm a senior compliance officer with 17 years of experience in financial regulation. I am not retired. I purchased the property at 412 Whitmore Lane through lawful means at fair market value, using my own funds. I had no prior knowledge that my son lived across the street when I first saw the listing. I identified it as a neighborhood I had grown familiar with over 3 years of visits. The house became available. I bought it." I paused. "My daughter-in-law told me on May 14th of this year to," and I quote directly, "get out," and that I was a penniless old woman with nothing to offer. My son stood in the hallway and said nothing. I went to a hotel. I found a listing. I bought a house. I paused again. "I have not trespassed. I have not harassed anyone. I have not violated any law or community standard. I have, however, had my mental fitness questioned in private communications to my neighbors, without evidence, by someone who appears to be uncomfortable with my proximity." I reached into my bag and placed 3 documents on the table. A copy of my purchase agreement showing the legal entity name, a copy of my employment verification letter, current employment, not former, and Paul's written account of Kristen's communications. "I'm placing these in the record," I said, "because I was told there were concerns. I believe in addressing concerns directly." I sat down. The room was very quiet. Kristen began to speak. "That's a completely," she's mischaracterizing, "Mrs. Holloway," Patricia said firmly and not unkindly. "We've heard from both parties. I don't think this is a matter for the neighborhood association to adjudicate. Mrs. Caldwell is a lawful property owner and has been a present and engaged member of this community. I'm going to move us along to the next item." "There are things she hasn't told you," Kristen said. "Kristen," Daniel said very quietly. It was the first word he had said all evening, and she stopped. I looked at my son then. He was looking at the table. His hands were flat on the tabletop, and I could see in the careful stillness of his posture something I recognized, the expression of a person who has finally, at great cost, seen the thing clearly. I looked away. Patricia moved to the next item. Someone asked about the crosswalk again. The meeting ended 40 minutes later. People filed out slowly. 3 of them stopped to speak to me. Briefly, without ceremony, in the way that people do when they want to register a position without making a speech of it. One of them was a woman I hadn't met before, named Helen, who shook my hand and said, My mother-in-law lived with us for 12 years. She was the best thing in our house. I thanked her. I drove home. I sat on my porch. The fireflies were gone. It was September, too late in the year. But the air was still and the street was quiet, and the magnolia tree was standing exactly where it had always been. I felt cold and clear and absolutely certain of myself. Beverly called me on a Friday morning, 3 weeks after the neighborhood association meeting. "I've been doing some research," she said, "into Mr. and Mrs. Holloway's financial situation for purposes of the defamation inquiry." "Tell me," I said. What she told me was not dramatic. It was the steady, unglamorous accumulation of poor decisions made by two people who had arranged their lives around assumptions that were no longer operable. Daniel and Kristen had purchased their house in Brookhaven 3 years ago at the top of their financial reach. Kristen had left her marketing position 8 months ago to pursue independent consulting, which had not produced meaningful income. Daniel's salary was comfortable, but not abundant. They had significant credit card debt from the renovation. The refurbished living room Kristen had photographed in white and gold and captioned, "Our Dream Home." They had also recently attempted to refinance the house and been declined. "Why declined?" I asked. "Debt-to-income ratio," Beverly said. "The renovation put them over the threshold. And Hollis hasn't filed anything. He won't. There's no case, and I suspect his retainer has not been replenished." I thought about this with the same professional equanimity I had applied to every financial assessment I had ever made. Here are the facts. Here are the conditions. Here is what is real. "I want to send Daniel a letter," I said, "personal, not legal, from me." I wrote it that afternoon at the kitchen table, longhand, on good stationery. I did not ask Beverly to review it. It was a letter from a mother to a son, and it said what I actually thought, without softening and without cruelty. It said that I knew about the refinancing denial. It said I had updated my will in June after he had called Paul to assess my financial dependency, and that the update was not punishment, but protection. It said that I did not believe he was an evil person, only a person who had allowed someone else's contempt to flow through him because it was easier than resisting it. It said that the money had never been a secret kept as a power move. It had been private because I had always believed that money disclosed carelessly becomes dangerous, and I had been right about that. It said that I would not be selling the house on Whitmore Lane. It said that I loved him, in the complicated way that parents love adult children who have disappointed them, not less than before, but differently, with the particular ache of someone who has reassessed a debt and found it still worth carrying. It said that if he ever wanted to sit at my kitchen table and have an honest conversation, not managed, not negotiated, not with an agenda underneath it, I would make coffee and be there. I folded it into an envelope and walked it across the street myself on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, and I put it through the mail slot in their dark gray front door. I heard it land on the other side. Then I walked back across Whitmore Lane, made dinner, and ate it at my kitchen table, in the house I owned. 2 days later, Hollis sent their final cease and desist, alleging my letter constituted unwanted contact. Beverly dispatched a reply within the hour. We did not hear from Hollis again. 3 months after the neighborhood meeting, Daniel called me on a Sunday evening. "Mom," he said. "Daniel," I said. "I've read the letter a lot of times. I couldn't figure out what to say." "There's no deadline," I said. "We're having some problems," he said. "Financial ones, and other ones." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry." And I was. Genuinely sorry. Not for the outcome, but for the fact that it had taken this much distance to get to the truth of things. "I think I need a real conversation," he said. "Come over," I said. "I'll make coffee." He came the following Sunday, alone. We talked for 3 hours. I will not reproduce that conversation. It was private in the way that genuinely reckoning conversations are private. Not because it contained secrets, but because it contained real things, said plainly, between people who had finally stopped managing each other. There were no winners in the way that word is usually meant. There was only the long, unglamorous, deeply necessary process of a family beginning to tell the truth to itself. I had started it by buying a house. Some things require a very large first move. The hydrangeas along the south fence came back beautifully in the spring. Doris had been right about the root system. Intact, just neglected. And with proper pruning and consistent watering through April, they produced that particular shade of blue lavender I have never been able to entirely predict, which I have come to appreciate as one of their finer qualities. I spent the first Saturday of May cutting stems for every room in the house, then extras for Doris and Helen, who had become, over the winter, a genuine friend. I was happy. I want to say that plainly. The house across the street was not an act of war. It was an act of self-possession, of refusing to be diminished and then going somewhere I could grow. I continued working, still not retired, my schedule refined to 3 full days and 2 half days, leaving time for the garden club, and the long walks along the creek trail. My firm gave me in November the most generous performance review of my career. I had begun attending a monthly lecture series on economic history at a local university, sitting in the 3rd row asking questions. Company I enjoyed, more than most things are. As for Kristen and Daniel, in February, Kristen accepted a full-time marketing position. The independent consulting chapter had not materialized. She did not post about it on social media. The refinancing was resubmitted in March and approved, at a higher rate, but approved. Daniel mentioned it on a Sunday with the careful tone of someone relieved and slightly ashamed of having required relief. Daniel came for coffee most Sundays now. We talked about work, the garden, Gerald. Once in April, he asked what my mother had been like. We sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours while the afternoon moved through the windows, and by the end, something had shifted. Quietly, the way real shifts happen. Kristen did not come. I was patient. I had learned to be. On a warm Saturday in May, I was on the porch when Doris looked across from her roses. "You look settled," she said. "I am," I said. "Settled." That was exactly the word.